There are moments you carry in your memory not because of what happened, but because of the silence that followed. It was the kind of ballroom that exists solely to be remembered. Crystal chandeliers that turned every surface into a reflection. Floral centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The kind of lighting engineered to make everyone look just a little bit better than they actually are. 200 people, maybe more, holding champagne flutes and engaging in conversations meant to be seen just as much as they were meant to be heard. In a corner of the room, a couple held each other with the calculated intimacy of people who desperately want to be noticed being intimate. He was in a tailored gray suit, broad-shouldered, wearing the easy smile of a man accustomed to smiling in all the right places. She was in a skin-tight red dress, young enough for the age gap to be glaringly obvious, wearing the smug look of someone who had clawed her way to exactly where she wanted to be, and needed the entire room to know it. When they saw the woman walk in, the man's smile grew wider. The woman in the red dress turned to the people around them and projected her voice, loud enough to ensure there was absolutely no doubt she wanted an audience. "Look who showed up. The bankrupt ex, desperate for a little attention." The man chuckled. He brought his champagne flute to his lips with the relaxed amusement of someone watching a play when they already know the ending. The woman who had just walked in was 45 years old, wearing a navy blue skirt suit that wasn't the most expensive outfit in the room, but was undeniably the most flawless. She glided across the ballroom with unhurried steps, not the forced slowness of someone nervous and trying to maintain control, but the deliberate pace of a woman who had arrived at the exact second she intended to, needing not a moment more or less. Her eyes were locked dead ahead. Her head was held high. She stepped onto the stage. She gripped the microphone with both hands, hands that did not shake, and waited for the silence she knew was coming. Over 45 years, she had learned that there is a specific kind of presence a room recognizes before a single word is even spoken. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was deep, crystal clear, the kind that doesn't need to shout to command a room. "My name is Sylvia. 1 year ago, my ex-husband and his mistress laughed in my face because I walked away from our divorce with absolutely nothing." A pause. Brief. Devastatingly effective. "Tonight, I'm here to show them what it actually means to own everything." Her right hand slipped into her blazer pocket in a slow, deliberate motion. She pulled out a heavy set of keys, gleaming silver, stamped with the engraved crest of a corporate conglomerate that every single person in that ballroom instantly recognized, and held them high for the room to see. The man in the gray suit let the champagne flute slip through his fingers. The crystal shattered, and the champagne bled across the marble floor like an unfinished sentence. The woman in red turned the exact color of her dress, not the vibrant glow, but the sickly, washed-out pallor that remains when all the blood violently drains from your face, and the entire ballroom fell dead silent. It was the kind of silence that the people in that room would later describe to anyone who hadn't been there, not because they wanted to gossip about Richard and Tiffany, but because they desperately needed to talk about Sylvia. Because there are rare moments when a person commands the dead center of a room, in a way that people feel in their bones but can never quite explain. This was one of those moments. But to truly understand the crushing weight behind that moment, the absolute gravity of those keys, the agonizing cost of that calm, what it took for Sylvia to step onto that stage with that kind of power, we need to rewind the clock. Not much, just 1 year, but it's a year that holds the weight of an entire lifetime. Sylvia had graduated from architecture school with top honors. It wasn't the kind of praise born from strategic networking. It was the raw, undeniable brilliance of someone who is fundamentally obsessed with her craft. The kind of student who spent sleepless nights hunched over drafting tables not out of obligation, but because she literally couldn't stop. Who looked at a vacant lot and didn't see empty space, but rather the living, breathing potential of what could exist there. Her professor spoke of her with that rare, hushed reverence reserved strictly for prodigies who shatter the boundaries of the curriculum. The job offer to join a top-tier firm in London had arrived the month she graduated. Not a speculative internship, but a concrete, highly lucrative contract from one of the most ruthless and respected architectural firms in Europe. She was 23 years old and had the entire world sitting in the palm of her hand. Richard had walked into her life 1 month before graduation. He was handsome in the specific way some men are, not a standalone beauty, but a magnetic charm that fed off the validation of others, glowing brighter the more eyes were glued to him. He was violently ambitious, A smooth talker, spinning massive plans that expanded with every conversation, possessing the lethal talent of making whoever was sitting next to him feel like those plans belonged to them too. Sylvia had fallen for him with the blinding, catastrophic speed of someone who hasn't yet learned that a love that rushes in too fast is usually trying to hide something in the blur. The conversation about the London firm happened 3 weeks into their relationship. Richard listened to the offer with an intensity she mistook for supportive interest, but which was, in reality, a cold, calculated risk assessment. Then, deploying a manipulative skill she wouldn't fully recognize for decades, he slowly began to reshape the narrative. He never explicitly told her not to go. He was too smart for that. Instead, he meticulously built a psychological architecture of alternatives around her, making London look smaller and smaller, while magnifying what they had right here. The real estate development firm he was trying to launch, the empire they could build side by side, the children they might have one day. She stayed, not out of bitter resentment, it is crucial to understand that. She stayed out of the pure, genuine love of a woman who chooses a man, blindly believing the sacrifice is mutual. They were married the following year. Peter was born 2 years after that, and her life slowly reorganized itself the way lives do, when one person quietly abandons their own dreams, to become the load-bearing pillar for someone else's. Silently, gradually, without a single explosive moment of rupture you could point to and say, "This is where it started dying." Sylvia never returned to architecture as an official career, but architecture never left her blood. She was the invisible ghost behind every single thing Richard built, literally. The blueprints his development firm pitched had her fingerprints embedded in the ink. The brilliant spatial concepts, the impossible cost-saving engineering hacks she unlocked through pure geometry, the ironclad vendor relationships she had cultivated over years with the exhausting patience of someone who knows that human capital is the foundation of any real empire. Richard signed the paperwork. Richard pitched the boardrooms. Richard soaked up the applause at high-end steakhouse dinners while Sylvia stayed home with Peter, quietly managing the chaos so those dinners could even happen. She didn't complain, not because she was blind to it, but because she had woven her entire identity so tightly around that marriage that it became impossible to amputate what was hers from what was theirs. Tiffany entered the picture 3 years ago. She was the firm's new executive assistant, ruthlessly efficient, hyper-observant, armed with that predatory emotional intelligence some people use to scan for what a powerful man desperately needs to hear, and deliver it exactly when he's most vulnerable. Richard was 45, suffering from that specific toxic vanity that infects wealthy, powerful men when they realize their youth is evaporating faster than their bank accounts are growing. Tiffany saw the bleeding wound clear as day, and she knew exactly how to twist the knife. It started slowly, it always does. And then, once she had dug her claws in deep, once she had successfully brainwashed Richard into believing that Sylvia was a heavy anchor dragging him down from his true potential, and Richard was begging to be brainwashed, because it's infinitely easier to paint your wife as the villain than to admit your entire empire was built on the marrow of her sacrifices. The execution was brutally fast. The divorce papers were served with the icy detachment of a corporate hostile takeover. Richard had hired attorneys who weren't just elite. They were apex predators who knew that the legal system is riddled with blind spots, and those blind spots can be violently exploited by whoever has the deepest pockets. The legal slaughter had been architected for months before Sylvia even knew she was at war. Documents had been forged to rewrite the company's history, erasing her sweat equity. Sworn affidavits legally downgraded 20 years of brilliant architectural consulting into informal domestic support. It was a meticulously crafted legal fiction painting her as a pampered, dependent housewife, rather than the silent partner who had laid every brick. At the courthouse, Tiffany had strutted in on Richard's arm, dripping with the smug arrogance of a woman who had already read the jury's verdict. Wearing a cocktail dress to a divorce hearing was a deliberate choice, not a lapse in taste, but an act of psychological warfare. She had turned to her group of sycophant friends and stage whispered, calibrating her voice to slice through the hallway and hit Sylvia right in the chest. She actually thought she owned the place. Look at her now, just another bankrupt nobody. Sylvia had heard every word. She felt every syllable impact her ribs with the terrifying precision of a sniper. She stood her ground, her spine rigid, adopting the posture of a woman who had learned that some agonizing wounds must be carried standing up. And she whispered to herself so quietly, it was barely more than a thought. One day, you are going to remember my name. It wasn't a threat. It was a blood oath, the kind of vow that requires no audience because the only witness that matters is the woman making it. The apartment she was forced to move into was barely 600 square feet, possessing the depressing, cramped functionality of a space cobbled together from the scraps of a demolished life. The furniture was whatever she had managed to salvage, not the high-end, curated pieces she had meticulously selected over 2 decades, but whatever garbage Richard's lawyers legally permitted her to drag out the door. There was a cheap drafting desk shoved against a drafty window, a small bookshelf holding the architectural volumes she refused to abandon even when everything else was stripped away, and resting on top, a framed photo of Peter at the beach, wearing the wide, unbroken smile of a kid who hasn't yet realized how violently the world can betray you. Peter was 19 years old, armed with that devastating, razor-sharp clarity specific to children who grow up quietly observing their parents' marriage and drawing the brutal conclusions the adults are too cowardly to admit. He had chosen his mother's side without a microsecond of hesitation, not because anyone pressured him, not out of convenience, but because he had run the moral arithmetic himself, and the answer was non-negotiable. He spent his weekends at her cramped apartment, radiating that quiet, grounding presence good sons deploy when they know their mother is drowning, but is too proud to ask for a life raft. He would sit at her tiny drafting table grinding through his engineering coursework, inhaling her home-cooked meals with the ravenous appetite of a kid who appreciates the love baked into the food more than the calories. They shared a heavy, unspoken solidarity forged in the fires of a childhood, built on thousands of quiet, honest moments. He rarely spoke of his father. When he did, it was lethal and brief. "He messed up, Mom, and so did she. There's really nothing left to analyze." Sylvia would listen, offering neither agreement nor defense. She had learned the hard way that the most profound truths are the ones a person arrives at entirely on their own. She scraped by, picking up informal consulting gigs. It was an honest grind, and that was all that mattered. Younger architects would seek her out under the table to troubleshoot complex blueprints, desperate for that veteran X-ray vision that isn't taught in university studios but is forged in the trenches of real-world crisis management. She charged a fair rate, which was tragically less than her true market value, because the shadow economy is inherently built on exploitation. But she was slowly laying bricks. She wasn't building wealth yet, but she was building a reputation. And a reputation, she knew better than anyone breathing, is the bedrock of every empire. She found the box on a random Tuesday afternoon while trying to organize the chaos. It was shoved into the darkest, dampest corner of the hallway closet, buried behind winter coats and rusty tools that hadn't seen daylight in years. A heavy cardboard banker's box. The faded label on the front was written in her own handwriting, dated 10 years ago. Inside, her blueprints. Not every single project she had ever touched, but the crown jewels. The impossible, complex architectural nightmares she had meticulously solved over the decades. The exact same designs Richard had brazenly paraded into boardrooms and claimed as his own genius. The towering high-rises that only stood upright today because she had cracked the structural algorithms his bloated engineering team couldn't comprehend. The sprawling residential complexes that had secured the firm's multi-million-dollar state contracts. The commercial floor plans that had convinced 3 massive retail conglomerates to sign exclusive deals with Richard's company. Every single page was dated. The entire developmental evolution was mapped out. And if you looked closely, her absolute DNA was branded into the paper. Her distinct, jagged handwriting crowding the margins. Complex calculus equations scribbled on the backs of vellum sheets. Her unique, undeniable problem-solving fingerprint that any seasoned architect in the city would recognize in a heartbeat. And every single final draft bore Richard's forged signature. She sat on the hard closet floor with the heavy box resting in her lap for an amount of time she couldn't begin to measure. The tears finally broke. Not a hysterical, acute sobbing, but the deep, agonizing weeping that violently forces its way out when you are confronted with the physical, irrefutable proof of a betrayal you always knew existed, but had allowed to rot in the fog of denial. 20 years. 20 years of her brilliant, exhausting labor had built another man's sprawling empire. While not a single legal document on the face of the earth acknowledged she even existed, she slammed the lid back onto the box. She violently wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. And she spoke to the cardboard box, to the musty closet, to the pathetic 600-square-foot apartment filled with the garbage scraps of her stolen life. One day, this is going to be my weapon. Not said with blinding rage, said with terrifying, absolute certainty. The difference between the two, she had learned, is that rage completely incinerates the person feeling it. Certainty, when it is ice cold and real, fuels them. And Sylvia was absolutely certain. What she didn't know yet was how long she would have to wait. But she had learned, through 2 decades of building skyscrapers in the shadows, that the timeline for perfect vengeance is never the timeline you want. It's the timeline the foundation requires to cure. And the cement on that box was finally dry. The invitation hit her inbox on a mundane Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a client's invoice and an automated bank alert. Sylvia was hunched over the drafting desk by the drafty window, ignoring a lukewarm cup of coffee, while reviewing a floor plan, when her phone violently buzzed against the wood. The sender was a corporate domain from the development firm, the exact domain name she had helped purchase, the company name she had personally chosen on a rainy afternoon when Richard was paralyzed between 3 garbage options, and she had pointed to the one that carried the heavy, undeniable resonance of a legacy. She opened it. It was an ultra-premium digital invitation, aggressively over-designed with that try-hard aesthetic typical of corporations desperate to project an illusion of old money. Gold serif fonts bleeding over a moody, aerial drone shot of their newest luxury high-rise. The event logistics stamped in bold. The firm's 25th anniversary, a black tie gala, a heavily curated guest list boasting industry titans, private equity whales, and elite architectural journalists. She scanned the text with the dead, icy calm of a woman reading a declaration of war she had been anticipating for months. Then her eyes locked onto the attached note. It wasn't part of the official corporate template. It was a customized memo field, the kind event software lets you inject to add a personal touch. The signature at the bottom read, Tiffany, and the message, dripping with the calculated toxic casualness of a high school mean girl who spent hours drafting a text to make it look effortless, read, "Hey sweetie, come see the empire you missed out on. It's going to be a blast. Don't forget to wear that cheap clearance rack dress." Sylvia stared at the glowing pixels for a long, heavy moment. She placed the phone face down on the drafting table. She picked up the ceramic mug. She took a slow sip of the freezing, bitter coffee. She looked out the window at the chaotic avenue below, watching the frantic, oblivious crowds marching to their useless jobs, and she sat entirely motionless for several minutes. It wasn't hesitation. It was the terrifying, silent realignment of a sniper adjusting her scope. Then she opened her digital calendar and blocked off the date. Peter found out that weekend. He walked through the front door, dropped his heavy engineering backpack on the floor, and found his mother carefully steam ironing the dark navy blue dress she kept religiously zipped in a garment bag for emergencies. "What's the occasion?" he asked, his voice laced with the hyper-vigilant intuition of a son who can read his mother's trauma like Braille. She told him, no theatrical drama, no playing the victim, just the cold, hard facts laid out in chronological order, including Tiffany's toxic little memo, because censoring the enemy's venom serves absolutely no tactical purpose. Peter stood dead silent for a long moment. Then, "Don't go, Mom." "I am going. They are trying to publicly humiliate you. That is exactly what they want. To drag you in there, parade you in front of the elite, and rub your face in the dirt. It's a psychological trap." Sylvia meticulously folded the navy dress over a velvet hanger, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle before she answered. "I know exactly what it is," she said softly, "but I need to look them dead in the eye." Peter opened his mouth to launch a counter-argument, and then snapped his jaw shut. He recognized the look mutating across his mother's face, a look he had spent 19 years deciphering. It wasn't reckless stubbornness. It wasn't a fragile, bruised ego. It was the terrifying, impenetrable resolve of a woman who had run the casualty math, accepted the risk, and permanently locked her coordinates. It was a determination that tolerated zero debate, because the internal jury had already delivered the verdict. He pivoted, walked into the cramped kitchen, disappeared for 3 minutes, and returned holding 2 glasses of orange juice. He handed one to his mother. "Then you walk in there with your head held high," he commanded. It was the only acceptable response left on the board. She smiled, that tiny, devastatingly complete smile that sons receive when they hit the absolute bullseye, without fully comprehending the weapon they fired. The dress Sylvia wore the night of the gala was not the most expensive garment in that sprawling ballroom. It wasn't even in the same tax bracket. It was a minimalist, midnight blue sheath dress she had scavenged from a clearance rack months ago. utilizing the ruthless pragmatism of a woman surviving on a microscopic budget. Superior fabric, flawless architectural cut, the exact kind of garment that refuses to apologize for its existence, but also refuses to scream for cheap attention. It was elegant in the rarest, most lethal way, not because of the price tag on the collar, but because of the absolute sheer force of the woman wearing it. She arrived completely alone. She delivered her name to the VIP check-in desk with the icy, unwavering authority of a woman who possesses the divine right to stand on any square foot of earth she chooses, accepted her lanyard, and breached the doors. The grand ballroom was exactly the gaudy spectacle she had anticipated. The firm knew how to throw a party. They always had, primarily because she had spent a decade establishing the exact luxury blueprints for how their corporate galas were supposed to function. The imported crystal chandeliers were identically opulent. The white glove catering was flawlessly timed, and the guests, armed with their vintage champagne and their bespoke tuxedos, and their hyper-analyzed designer gowns, were just the polished high-definition versions of the exact same corporate sharks she had been swimming with for decades. She knew half of their names by heart. Some of the executives spotted her walking in, and their eyes instantly flared with that specific nauseating cocktail of recognition and crippling social panic, the deer-in-the-headlights stare of cowards who have absolutely no idea how to greet a woman who was violently erased from the official corporate history books. Sylvia greeted them with terrifying ease. She asked piercing, highly informed questions about their current zoning permits, their kids' Ivy League tuitions, their quarterly margins. She occupied the space exactly the way she always had, not desperately begging to be seen, but moving with the undeniable gravity of someone who fundamentally belonged there. Tiffany's vicious little clique of sycophants spotted her before Tiffany did. They were three women in their early 30s bound together by the toxic, parasitic gravity that forms around an alpha narcissist, defining their own pathetic self-worth by how much venom their queen allowed them to spit. They huddled together, executing that fake theatrical whispering designed specifically to be overheard by the victim while maintaining plausible deniability. "Oh my God," one of them scoffed, her voice perfectly pitched to slice through the jazz band. She actually showed her face. The sheer desperation is embarrassing. Sylvia heard every syllable. She kept walking. She had learned through a year of surviving in the trenches that malicious words only detonate if you volunteer to swallow the grenade, and she wasn't swallowing a damn thing tonight. Richard intercepted her 20 minutes into the cocktail hour. He was wearing his trademark $1 million smile, that slick, weaponized charisma that had hypnotized her 20 years ago. It was just genuine enough to disarm a mark, and deeply calculated enough to close a massive deal. But up close, hovering in his eyes, was a microscopic fracture she had never noticed before, or perhaps she had, but had been standing too close to the blast radius to identify it. It was the haunted, restless stare of a man who had stolen the crown, slaughtered the king, and was utterly terrified to discover he still felt like a fraud, as if the ledger in his brain was bleeding red ink no matter how many zeros he added to his bank account. "Sylvia," he purred, layering his voice with a fake, patronizing surprise. "I'm genuinely shocked you made it." "Richard, look at how much the Empire has scaled." He gestured grandly to the crystal-draped ceiling, sweeping his arm across the sea of elite investors as if he were a god presenting the cosmos he built with his bare hands. "It's a tragic shame you couldn't hang on for the ride." Buried in those words was the petty, sadistic cruelty of a weak man who knows exactly where the vulnerable arteries are and lacks the basic human discipline to stop himself from slicing them open. Sylvia locked eyes with him, radiating absolutely zero rage, starving him of the hysterical emotional reaction he was desperately craving, and delivered her response with the chilling, subsonic frequency of a hollow-point bullet. "This empire scaled on the blueprints I drafted in my sleep, Richard. You just held the pen." His plastic smile didn't drop, but the muscles under his left eye violently twitched, a tiny involuntary spasm that betrays a liar when a brutal truth hits them square in the jaw. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Always stuck in your pathetic little delusions," he sneered, his tone instantly downshifting into the aggressive, defensive cadence of a cornered animal trying to gaslight its way out of a trap. And he quickly walked away. Sylvia stood completely still, the stem of her champagne flute resting gently between her fingers, watching her ex-husband's tailored back retreat into the crowd. A wave of profound, icy clarity washed over her. He had physically shrunk. Not his height, not his Rolex, not his net worth, but something foundational inside his soul had withered away into dust. The gala grinded on. Sylvia glided through the room. She cornered veteran material suppliers who greeted her with authentic, relieved warmth. She tracked down 2 senior structural engineers who had fought in the trenches with her for years. Safely out of Richard's line of sight, they whispered confessions of loyalty that were worth more than $1 billion severance package. Those hushed conversations offered an unprompted, beautiful validation. The absolute proof that genuine, bleeding-edge genius leaves an indelible watermark that forged signatures can never fully bleach away. Then Tiffany stepped up to the microphone. She was a woman who knew exactly how to wield a PA system, not in the technical sense, but armed with the sociopathic understanding that amplified audio is a weapon of mass subjugation, and she intended to use it to execute hostages. She had clearly meticulously rehearsed her monologue in the mirror. Her blood-red gown was violently loud, architected to ensure no retina in the room could escape her. Her voice echoed off the marble with the sickening polish of a politician. Her speech was a fabricated mythology of the firm's 25-year history. She waxed poetic about Richard's unparalleled visionary genius, the grueling sacrifices of the executive team, the unwavering faith of the venture capitalists, the synergy of their corporate partners. It was a sprawling, epic narrative that Sylvia could have ghostwritten blindfolded, because Sylvia had literally bled into the mortar of every single story. She knew the agonizing midnight decisions that triggered the explosive quarterly profits. She knew the literal blood, sweat, and panic buried beneath the sanitized metrics Tiffany was rattling off like she owned them. Name by nauseating name, Tiffany rained down gratitude. Richard. The VP of Acquisitions, the lead developers, the angel investors, the junior architects hired barely 5 years ago, frauds currently sitting in corner offices, building their pathetic careers on the impenetrable concrete foundations Sylvia had poured with her bare hands. Sylvia's name was never spoken. It wasn't an accidental oversight. It was a highly calculated, aggressive erasure. It was the specific, sadistic brand of omission that screams louder than a physical slap across the face, engineered to force the victim to sit in the suffocating vacuum of their own non-existence and swallow the humiliation whole. Sylvia stood near the center of the ballroom, her hand gripping her glass, listening to the microphone broadcast the names of dozens of mediocre men, while the architect of the empire was buried alive in silence. Then Tiffany wrapped up the official corporate propaganda, and she let the silence hang. It was the heavy, pregnant pause of an executioner raising the axe, preparing to go completely off the teleprompter. She scanned the sea of tuxedos. She locked her eyes onto Sylvia with the terrifying, laser-guided precision of a drone strike. And she purred into the microphone, flashing a toxic, pearly white smile engineered to look like harmless banter. And, of course, a massive, heartfelt thank you to Richard's ex-wife for graciously stepping out of the spotlight so I could finally shine. A brutal, agonizing pause to let the poison seep into the floorboards. Here's a toast to the losers. The ballroom recoiled. A few sycophants giggled. Not a roar of applause, but that pathetic, cowardly, nervous tittering of hostages trapped in a room where the psychopath with the microphone dictates the rules of survival. Other executives stared violently down at their Gucci loafers. And the veterans, the ones who had spoken to Sylvia an hour ago, the ones who actually knew the buried bodies and the stolen blueprints, stood completely paralyzed, their faces twisting into a miserable cocktail of visceral disgust and secondhand shame. Sylvia felt the inferno erupt in her chest. It wasn't uncontrolled rage, or if it was a rage that had finally breached the dam and was flooding the control room. It was that suffocating physical heat behind the eyes that signals the body has absorbed a catastrophic amount of trauma, and the levees are seconds away from collapsing. She gently placed her champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray. She turned and navigated the crowded ballroom, maintaining her exact flawless posture, spine straight, chin level, unhurried steps. She found the marble corridor. She found the women's restroom. She pushed through the heavy door and through the deadbolt, the metallic clack of the lock echoing like the only sanctuary left in a hostile war zone. She stood dead center in front of the vanity mirror. For a long, suffocating minute, she just stared at her own reflection. The midnight blue dress, the immaculate hair, the exhausted face that had spent 365 days desperately fighting to conceal the agonizing hemorrhage happening beneath the skin. and then she broke down. It didn't last long. It wasn't the theatrical, wailing grief that demands an audience or begs for pity. It was the brutal, utilitarian sobbing of a warrior who simply needed to vomit out the crushing, unbearable weight she had been dragging up a mountain for a year. The kind of weeping that brutally empties you out, but leaves your skeleton standing upright. Vastly different from the kind of grief that leaves you crawling on the floor. She turned on the gold faucet. She soaked the cuff of her sleeve in ice-cold water and pressed it aggressively against her swollen eyes. She looked back up into the mirror. She recognized the predator staring back at her. It wasn't the shattered, bleeding victim who had limped out of family court 12 months ago with a joke of an alimony check, a shoebox apartment, and the hollow stare of a woman stripped to the bone. This creature was entirely different. Her skin was thicker. Her bones were forged in titanium, radiating that terrifying, impenetrable armor that only crystallizes after you survive a fatal wound and refuse to die. It's hard to believe a human being is capable of that level of sociopathic cruelty, isn't it? Weaponizing a hot microphone, weaponizing a room full of elite peers, weaponizing 25 years of stolen labor to publicly butcher the woman who actually poured the concrete. If your blood is boiling over what they did to Sylvia, smash that like button right now to prove you are standing in her corner, because that night was far from over, and the apocalypse coming for them. The nuclear fallout Sylvia had been quietly enriching in the dead silence of her cramped apartment, in the midnight hours hunched over her stolen blueprints, in the encrypted phone calls with ruthless allies, was hurtling toward them with the absolute, terrifying inevitability of a freight train. Tiffany had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. She had confused a woman who walked away with nothing for a woman who had nothing. And that microscopic error in judgment she was about to discover was the exact difference between her pathetic little fairy tale and her impending slaughter. The days following the gala possessed the thick, suffocating texture of a body going into systemic shock. It wasn't a conscious, planned retreat. It was the brutal biological shutdown that triggers when you've been redlining on adrenaline for a year, and your nervous system violently yanks the emergency brake to audit the damage. Sylvia would wake up, stare blankly at the popcorn ceiling of her tiny apartment, and just lie there paralyzed. It wasn't acute, stabbing depression. It was a heavy, bone-deep fatigue. The exhaustion of a soldier who had spent a year fighting hand-to-hand combat just to stay on her feet, only to be ambushed in a ballroom and forced to bleed out in a locked bathroom stall. She stopped eating. Her freelance work ground to a halt. Urgent client emails sat rotting in her inbox like unexploded ordnance. Peter arrived on a Thursday. It wasn't the weekend. He skipped classes to be there, which meant his hyper-vigilant radar had picked up on the silence, and he wasn't waiting for an invitation. That was the tragic superpower she had accidentally installed in her son, the terrifying ability to read the screams buried inside the silence. He yanked open the empty fridge, surveyed the depressing wasteland of expired condiments, walked back out the door, hit the grocery store, and returned to cook a massive meal. He dragged her to the tiny table and forced her to eat, refusing to turn her trauma into an interrogation. Later, when the dishes were scrubbed and the apartment was draped in shadows, he stood dead center in the living room and fired his shot. "Mom, you are a master architect." She stared at him. "You built that entire empire. The blueprints, the zoning loopholes, the structural crisis management that saved their bloated engineering team. That was all you." His voice wasn't laced with hot, impulsive anger. It carried the chilling, lethal objectivity of an engineer laying out a schematic. "Why the hell don't you just burn it down and start from scratch?" Sylvia sat frozen in the silence. "Starting from zero is a bloodbath, Peter. Is it more of a bloodbath than rotting in this chair?" It was a sniper's bullet, fired with flawless precision, delivered without malice, without guilt-tripping, just the blunt force trauma of 19-year-old honesty that hasn't yet been corrupted by the polite cowardice of adulthood. She didn't utter a single word that night, but the next morning she shot out of bed before the alarm triggered, marched straight to her drafting desk, booted up her laptop, and began to architect a war. The battle plan was structurally elegant, but tactically brutal, exactly like her best skyscrapers. A boutique architecture firm to start. She didn't need a sprawling glass tower, she just needed an LLC, a high-powered workstation, and enough operational runway to survive the 6-month drought before client retainers cleared. She had the lethal portfolio, even if it was technically ghost-written. She had the physical blueprints locked in the closet. She owned the black book of VIP vendor contacts. She possessed the raw, irreplaceable genius that no sleazy divorce lawyer could ever subpoena out of her skull. She walked into the commercial bank armed with her printed prospectus, her profit-loss projections aggressively vetted, radiating the terrifying confidence of a woman who had spent 2 decades pitching 9-figure developments to venture capitalists, so her husband could take the credit. The loan officer reviewed the binder with genuine awe. Then he clicked his mouse, stared at his monitor, and his face collapsed into the nauseating grimace of a man who is about to shoot a puppy. "Mrs. Hayes," he stammered, adopting the sterile, defensive tone bank employees use to deliver executions. "Unfortunately, there are severe, catastrophic derogatory marks attached to your Social Security number that trigger an automatic hard stop on all credit approvals." She slowly tilted her head. What kind of derogatory marks? He rotated the flat-screen monitor just enough for her to see the bloodbath. Defaults. Massive, hemorrhaging corporate debts. Not her personal credit cards, but massive joint liabilities from the marriage that Richard had aggressively stopped servicing the second the divorce papers were filed, intentionally letting the nuclear fallout rain down entirely on her credit score while he walked away clean. She walked out of the bank lobby carrying her rejected binder, vibrating with an ice-cold fury that provided absolutely no warmth. It only provided terrifying clarity. The backup plan, she calculated, was liquidating the apartment. She could dump the property, pay off Richard's weaponized debt, and funnel the scraps into seed capital. It would be a pathetic shoestring budget, but it was enough to buy ammunition. She dragged a cutthroat real estate broker into the apartment that exact same week. 2 days later, the broker called her back, her voice dripping with the uncomfortable tension of someone delivering a death sentence. "Sylvia, there's a massive secondary lien on the deed." "What are you talking about?" "A commercial mortgage was slapped on the property 18 months ago, before the divorce decree was legally finalized. The apartment is locked up as collateral for a multi-million-dollar corporate bridge loan." Sylvia squeezed her eyes shut, fighting off a wave of violent vertigo. Richard had secretly mortgaged the apartment, the exact same pathetic shoebox apartment he had generously surrendered to her in the divorce settlement, the sole physical asset she had walked away with, before the ink on the asset division was even dry. He had exploited a grotesque legal loophole his corrupt attorneys had buried in the fine print, a trap she had walked right into because she had naively believed the settlement was a ceasefire. She dragged her lawyer back into the ring. The attorney was brutally honest. They had absolute legal grounds to nuke the lien, but the justice system is a meat grinder. It would require a minimum of 18 months of relentless, bloody litigation, appeals, injunctions, and bleeding legal fees to clear the title. In the meantime, the asset was completely frozen, and the seed capital she desperately needed remained a ghost. The hit on Peter arrived on a bleak Monday morning via a sterile 2-line text message, the brutal brevity of a kid delivering catastrophic news and desperately wanting to rip the Band-Aid off. "Mom, we need to talk." "Tonight?" She knew it was a fatal blow before he even unlocked the door. He delivered the execution with the chilling efficiency of a boy who has accepted that sugarcoating a tragedy only prolongs the bleeding. His father had completely severed his university allowance. No warning phone call, no explanation, just a sterile automated email from Richard's wealth management firm formally terminating the tuition wire transfers, effective immediately. Peter had already run the triage math. Financial aid was possible, but the bureaucracy was a nightmare. The application windows were closed, the administrative backlog was massive, and the crushing gap between today and the day the federal grants cleared was unbridgeable. Private student loans required a co-signer with perfect credit, which was completely off the table. And the university bursar office wasn't going to wait around for a miracle. "I'm taking a leave of absence for the semester," he stated flatly. His jaw was clenched tight, fighting a violent internal war to refuse to let his father's sabotage break his spirit. "I already signed up to drive for a delivery app. I can cover my half of the rent and stockpile cash. The second I have the liquidity, I'm re-enrolling." Sylvia sat completely paralyzed. There was a specific, sickening brand of evil in this attack that eclipsed every other nightmare she had survived. The public humiliation at the gala, the fraudulent lien, the destroyed credit score, the stolen blueprints. All of those were targeted drone strikes on her. She was a grown woman. She had willingly married the sociopath, and she possessed the titanium psychological armor forged by decades of war to absorb the shrapnel. But Peter hadn't signed a damn contract. Peter had simply chosen his mother. He had chosen his engineering degree. He had chosen loyalty over a billionaire's bribes. And now he was being violently punished for a war he didn't start, paying an exorbitant price that was fundamentally, sickeningly unfair. She didn't say a single word that night. She wrapped her arms around her son and squeezed until her muscles burned. She stayed like that for a long time. And when he finally drove back to his dorm to pack his life into boxes, she sat alone at the drafting desk, the window wide open, the screeching sirens of the city bleeding into the room. She stared at the useless business plan glowing on her monitor, and for the very first time in a year of hell, she felt the terrifying, weightless sensation of stepping off a cliff and realizing there was absolutely no net. The job opening had been a holy grail. Senior architect at the most aggressive, ruthless competitor in Richard's market, a billion-dollar firm handling bleeding-edge commercial towers. It was the exact sniper position that would weaponize her elite skill set, paying a massive base salary that would instantly vaporize her debt and fund her ultimate revenge. She had submitted her portfolio with the hyper-calculated, guarded hope of a woman terrified of being disappointed, but utterly incapable of giving up. She slaughtered the first interview. She dominated the second. She marched into the third round, a brutal 3-hour technical grilling in front of a firing squad of senior partners. And this was the exact arena where she was an apex predator. It was the blood-soaked coliseum where Ivy League theory was stripped away and decades of real-world crisis management reigned supreme. The board had been visibly stunned. She walked out of the glass boardroom vibrating with that quiet, terrifying certainty of a professional who knows they just ended the competition. 3 days later, her phone rang. It was the CEO. Not an HR flunky, the billionaire founder of the firm, personally making the call. A detail she was desperately trying to interpret as a massive victory when he started speaking. "Sylvia, I'm calling you myself because I owe you the brutal truth," he sighed, adopting the exhausted, gravelly tone of a CEO executing a hit he hates. "You destroyed the panel. Technically, there isn't a single architect in this city who can touch you. But Richard called my cell phone last night. He explicitly demanded I blacklist you. He told me you were a radioactive, volatile liability, and Richard and I have a 15-year, 9-figure supply chain partnership, so—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Sylvia absorbed the execution, the pathetic corporate apologies, the sterile boardroom jargon that wraps cowardice in a 3-piece suit, with the phone glued to her ear and her dead eyes locked on the ceiling. When the line finally clicked dead, she sat perfectly motionless in her desk chair for an eternity. Richard's tentacles had reached her. He had nuked the job offer. He had nuked their son's education. He had systematically hunted down every single emergency exit she had managed to pry open, and he had poured concrete over the doors. He wasn't just defending his stolen empire. He was running a scorched earth annihilation protocol because his ultimate goal was her total, psychological suicide. She dragged herself to the mattress. She lay flat on her back, fully clothed, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling while the afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight, and the streetlights began violently slicing through the blinds. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just hovered in that horrifying, paralyzed purgatory between crushing exhaustion and manic hyper-awareness, where thoughts drift like debris in the aftermath of a bombing. Sometime after midnight, she slowly pushed herself off the mattress. She drifted toward the hallway closet, not driven by any specific tactical logic, but guided by the mindless zombie-like autopilot of a trauma victim pacing their own cage. She opened the door. She stared blankly at the stacks of cardboard boxes. The heavy banker's box was sitting right where she had left it. She dragged it out. She dropped it onto the cheap laminate floor and ripped the lid off, acting with the frantic, thoughtless urgency of someone digging for a weapon in the dark. The stolen blueprints were exactly where she left them. The vellum sheets, the structural calculus, the 20 years of her ghost-written legacy. She traced her fingertips over the jagged lines of her own handwriting with the heartbreaking, tactile familiarity of a mother touching a stolen child's photograph. That was when her fingers brushed against something foreign at the bottom. Crushed beneath the final stack of commercial blueprints, there was a sealed envelope. It wasn't hers. She didn't recognize the stationery. She didn't recognize the heavy yellowing parchment that smelled of dust and decades. She didn't recognize the meticulous, old-world way it was folded. But the second she pulled it into the lamplight, her heart violently stopped. It was her father's handwriting. Her father had died 7 years ago. He had passed away in the quiet, dignified silence of a man who had survived a grueling life and possessed zero fear of the dark, leaving behind a pathetic bank account, but an absolute fortune in the kind of moral currency that cash can never buy. Sylvia had blindly shoved his personal documents into random archive boxes during the suffocating haze of her grief, desperate to organize the physical debris because it was the only thing she could control. This letter had been sleeping at the bottom of her stolen blueprints for nearly a decade, for a reason she couldn't possibly fathom. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. "My beautiful daughter, if you are reading this, it means I wasn't there to protect you when the wolves came to the door. I am so deeply sorry for that. You were always the brilliant one, but brilliant people are often blind to evil. I learned that the hard way watching your grandfather's life. He was far too honorable for a world that violently punishes good men who refuse to play dirty. Because of that, he taught me a brutal lesson, and I am passing it to you right now. Never, under any circumstances, hand a man the keys to your entire life. Always bury an ace in the dirt. The economy crashes, empires burn, vows are shattered. But the ace you bury in the dirt survives the fire. Your grandfather's ace has been buried since before you took your first breath. I never had to dig it up. It belongs to you now." The letter ended with a typed address, a heavy security private bank in the financial district, a specific vault number, and taped to the bottom of the parchment, stained with the faint orange rust of a weapon that had spent decades waiting to be fired, was a key. Sylvia sat completely paralyzed, staring at the cold metal in her palm. It was heavy and antique, the long, jagged brass skeleton key of a mid-century safe deposit box, possessing that brutal, undeniable weight that modern plastic keycards completely lack. The brass was oxidized and blackening at the edges, but the teeth were flawlessly sharp. She slowly closed her fist around it. The apartment was dead silent. The chaotic screams of the city raged on outside the window, and Sylvia sat cross-legged on the closet floor, gripping her dead father's letter in her left hand and a rusted brass key in her right, feeling a terrifying tectonic shift inside her chest. A sensation that still didn't have a name, but was the absolute polar opposite of the suicidal despair she had been drowning in 3 hours ago. It was the crushing gravity of a dormant nuclear warhead, a weapon that had been quietly waiting in the dark long before she even knew she was at war, and which, with the terrifying silent patience of fate, had remained buried until the exact second she was ready to pull the trigger. The bank was a massive Gothic fortress, dominating a cobblestone street in the financial district, a relic that time had treated with extreme reverence, its towering marble columns projecting that aggressive, old money invincibility that doesn't require a neon sign to prove its net worth. Sylvia walked through the brass revolving doors on a Tuesday morning, clutching the heavy antique key deep inside her trenchcoat pocket, the folded letter resting against her ribs like a bulletproof vest. She had slept for maybe 2 hours, not thrashing with anxiety but hovering in that hyper-lethal predatory state where the brain refuses to shut down, relentlessly running simulations, calculating blast radiuses, and wargaming the apocalypse. The vault manager who greeted her was a severe man in his 60s, radiating the strict absolute discretion that elite institutions violently enforce in their staff. She surrendered the rusted key, the vault serial number, her federal IDs, and the letter verifying her grandfather as the original signatory. He inspected the documents with the cold, methodical precision of a man who routinely handles the secrets of billionaires. It took 15 agonizing minutes for him to verify the dusty microfilm ledgers and escort her down into the subterranean vault. It was a freezing, low-ceilinged bunker, bathed in sickly yellow halogen light. The walls lined floor to ceiling with brushed steel boxes, suffocating in that heavy, pressurized silence, unique to rooms where massive fortunes and dangerous secrets are buried alive. The vault number matching her father's letter was located in the 3rd row, bottom left, its brass faceplate oxidized and neglected. The key slid into the lock with a heavy, grinding resistance. She gripped it with both hands and brutally twisted. The steel door clicked open. Resting inside the pitch-black steel tunnel was a massive, heavy-duty craft paper envelope. The edges were crumbling and yellowed, sealed with a thick puddle of crimson wax that had hardened into stone over the decades, but remained entirely unbroken, as if time itself had refused to tamper with the explosive payload inside. Lying directly on top of it was a smaller letter, folded in sharp thirds with militant precision. She carefully pulled the artifacts out. She stood dead center in the freezing vault, her breath pluming in the cold air. She ripped open the heavy craft envelope first. They were original, watermarked property deeds, heavy parchment stamped with the raised federal notary seals of a bygone era. The legal demarcations meticulously drafted in the elegant, looping calligraphy of mid-century clerks. 3 separate, sprawling land deeds, 3 massive territorial grids outlined with the dense, hyper-specific zoning vocabulary that she, as a master architect, could instantly translate in her sleep. She recognized the street coordinates before she even finished scanning the first page. They were massive, undeveloped lots located in the absolute dead center of the city's hyper-inflated commercial district. The kind of catastrophic billion-dollar real estate that developers don't even refer to as land anymore. They refer to them as apex strategic assets. The kind of legendary, mythological dirt that mega corporations bleed millions of dollars in legal fees trying to acquire, because the actual market value completely breaks the calculator. She frantically scanned the second deed, then the third, then she ripped open the smaller, folded letter. It was her grandfather's handwriting, sharper and more aggressive than her father's, the jagged cursive of a ruthless survivor from an era when a man's signature was a legally binding blood oath. I bought this dirt in 1974 because I knew the city's arteries would eventually bleed in this direction. They did. I never had the war chest to develop the skyscrapers myself, but I refused to sell it to the vultures, because my father taught me that you never surrender king-making dirt. When I die, the crown passes to your father. When he dies, it passes to his blood. Do not sell it for pennies. Do not sell it in a panic. And never, ever let a man in a suit convince you that you are holding anything less than a nuclear bomb. With love, your grandfather. Sylvia stood entirely paralyzed in the subterranean vault for a stretch of time that ceased to exist. There was a low, rushing sound in the freezing room that she didn't identify until several minutes later. It was the sound of her own lungs aggressively exhaling, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding for 12 miserable months. 3 massive, undeveloped commercial lots, located in the absolute heart of the city's financial district, legally registered in her bloodline, fully transferable by inheritance, ironclad and notarized by the federal government 50 years ago. She summoned the vault manager. She ordered him to execute heavily notarized duplicate copies of every single sheet of parchment. Then she marched out of the Gothic bank, clutching the original craft envelope tight against her sternum, guarding it with the terrifying ferocity of a mother shielding an infant in a war zone. Outside, the city violently roared on. Taxis shrieked. Suits marched down the pavement, utterly oblivious to the fact that a tectonic plate had just violently shifted beneath the concrete. Sylvia stood on the curb, the harsh morning sun blinding her eyes. And then, the memory hit her. The flashback detonated in her brain with the sickening high-definition clarity of a buried trauma suddenly unearthing itself. 3, maybe 4 years before the divorce papers were served, Richard had stormed into their penthouse in a state of rare, unhinged fury. He was a psychopath who prided himself on absolute emotional control, deploying a sociopathic calm as a business weapon. But that specific night, he had slammed the door, his shoulders coiled tight, radiating the violent, destructive energy of a king who had just been denied a crown. She had asked him what was wrong. He had paced the floor, barking that there was a massive prime commercial grid in the dead center of the financial district that was the absolute holy grail for his firm's next billion-dollar flagship tower. Flawless zoning, apocalyptic square footage, a generational unicorn that never hits the open market. He had deployed an army of cutthroat acquisitions brokers. He had weaponized his elite legal team to aggressively hunt down the property records. "The owners are ghosts," he had screamed, hurling his scotch glass into the fireplace. "The records are buried in some archaic federal vault. We can't find the damn bloodline." He had bled millions over 2 years trying to illegally pry those lots out of the dirt, and had failed spectacularly. He eventually surrendered, pivoting the firm's capital into a mediocre secondary project. But that specific failure had haunted him for years, the agonizing phantom pain of a predator who had missed the kill of the century. Sylvia had listened to his pathetic tantrum with the dutiful, invisible patience of a good wife. She had offered the hollow, soothing platitudes wives are expected to provide when their husbands fail. And she had completely deleted the conversation from her hard drive because she had 1,000 actual structural fires to put out, and his bruised ego wasn't a priority. The owners were ghosts. The owners were her grandfather, her father, her. The sheer cosmic irony of the revelation was so staggering it caused the sidewalk to tilt beneath her boots. Richard had spent years desperately trying to buy the ground out from under the exact woman he would later butcher in divorce court. The woman he would banish to a rat-infested studio apartment. The woman he would relentlessly hunt and starve, ensuring she couldn't secure a job, a loan, or an exit. The holy grail his empire required to survive had been sitting quietly in the dark, legally belonging to the wife he threw away like garbage. While he fruitlessly threw millions of dollars at the wind, she walked over to a wrought iron city bench and collapsed onto it, the explosive documents resting in her lap, and spent 10 minutes simply remembering how to breathe oxygen. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed a corporate assassin. The brutal legal mechanics of executing the title transfers took exactly 6 weeks. The attorney, a ruthless, hyper-specialized probate litigator recommended by a veteran architect who loathed Richard and owed Sylvia her life, was a surgeon. The chain of inheritance was bulletproof, from the grandfather to the father, from the father to Sylvia, armed with the original unassailable notarized chain of custody that proved every single link in the bloodline. There wasn't a corporate loophole on earth that could penetrate the armor. But while the deeds were quietly transferring into Sylvia's LLC, the lawyer was executing a shadow operation. He was hunting. It wasn't explicitly ordered by Sylvia. It was the aggressive initiative that apex predators take when they smell a fresh blood trail. He had subpoenaed the unredacted corporate ledgers of Richard's entire conglomerate during his risk assessment of the fraudulent apartment lien. And buried deep inside the corporate intestines, he had struck a massive, hemorrhaging artery. One of the anonymous shell companies deeply embedded in Richard's corporate architecture, an LLC registered under a vague, ghost kitchen operating agreement, the exact kind of black box entity conglomerates use to hide massive liabilities off the official P&L sheet, was legally registered exclusively to Tiffany. But the multi-million-dollar seed capital used to incorporate it had been wired from a joint account, Sylvia and Richard's joint marital account, weeks before the divorce. The attorney dropped the explosive file onto Sylvia's desk with the dead-eyed, terrifying calm of a bomb technician handing over a live nuke. But his eyes betrayed the lethal thrill of a man who knows he just secured a decapitation strike. That shell company had been heavily weaponized to launder massive, untaxed corporate slush funds. It was textbook, federal felony tax evasion. Not a sloppy accounting error, but a highly sophisticated, aggressively documented RICO violation that triggers immediate FBI raids. And the lawyer had successfully tracked the digital blood spatter linking the slush fund directly to Richard, utilizing subpoenaed divorce discovery documents that had previously been ignored because no one knew exactly what to look for. Sylvia absorbed the briefing in total silence. She aggressively interrogated the lawyer's methodology. She demanded the raw bank ledgers. She scrutinized the offshore routing numbers. She read the files, and then she read them again. Then she sat dead still in her chair, staring out the lawyer's high-rise window at the sprawling concrete grid of the city below. "What is your authorization code to execute the strike?" the lawyer asked quietly. "Hold your fire," she ordered, her voice absolute zero. "We are not launching yet." The lawyer stared at her, his face twisting with the immense frustrated confusion of an attacked dog yanking at the leash. "You are tactically correct to hold the leverage," he conceded slowly. "Premature detonation alerts the target and compromises our kill radius." "It isn't just about the blast radius," she whispered, and she refused to elaborate. But a terrifying, hyper-complex schematic was aggressively rendering in her brain, not a chaotic emotional revenge fantasy, but the cold, calculating structural engineering that had defined her genius for 20 years. The tactical architecture that had been sleeping, starved of a project, was fully awake, and it had just found its masterpiece. The 3 commercial lots were formally appraised 2 months after the title transfer cleared. The official valuation the senior appraiser slid across the desk was exactly $83 million. He delivered the staggering number with the sterile, clinical detachment required by his profession. But there was a visible, awe-struck tremor in his eyes when he looked up at her. The terrified respect of a man who realizes he is sitting across from a newly minted apex predator. Sylvia instantly leveraged a fraction of that apocalyptic net worth to secure an ironclad credit line. Not to buy a penthouse. Not to lease her new architecture firm, not yet. She required liquid capital for a highly surgical covert operation. A tactical strike she had meticulously war-gamed during hundreds of sleepless nights, armed with an encyclopedic map of Richard's corporate vulnerabilities burned into her prefrontal cortex. She knew the entire supply chain architecture better than any Wall Street analyst because she had literally designed the scaffolding 2 decades ago. She knew exactly which concrete and steel vendors were the lifeblood of Richard's flagship towers. She knew which exclusive logistics contractors were physically impossible to replace within a 3-year window. She knew which holding companies controlled the union labor contracts that Richard absolutely could not afford to breach without triggering a billion-dollar implosion. She knew exactly where the steel beams were invincible, and she knew exactly where the foundational concrete was rotting, because she had vetted those contractors, negotiated the initial blood oaths in smoke-filled rooms, and quietly stepped out so Richard could walk in and sign the paperwork. Over the next 6 agonizing months, moving with the terrifying invisible patience of a ghost, she began acquiring equity, not dropping massive, loud block trades that trigger SEC alarms. She executed microscopic, aggressive, hostile takeovers through a labyrinth of heavily anonymized proxy LLCs, deploying the weaponized corporate architecture her lawyer had engineered to ensure absolute, impenetrable stealth. Vendor by vendor, month by bleeding month. At the end of the 6-month bloodbath, Sylvia was the undisputed majority shareholder of the 3 primary supply chain conglomerates that were the absolute beating heart of Richard's entire real estate empire. Richard had no idea. Tiffany had no idea. Not a single one of the elite sociopaths who had clinked glasses in that ballroom, who had giggled at the toast to the losers, who had watched a woman in a navy suit flee to a bathroom and done absolutely nothing. Not one of them had the slightest clue that a nuclear winter had just been quietly constructed around them, while they arrogantly assumed Sylvia was still digging for scraps in the dirt. She wasn't digging. She was pouring concrete, pouring it the exact same way she always had, using the raw materials in front of her, wielding the genius she owned, operating with the terrifying patience of a master architect who knows the underground foundation must cure completely in the dark before the skyscraper violently breaches the surface. And the foundation was fully cured. The next phase was erecting the steel. And the steel framework, as she had learned from her grandfather, her father, and 2 decades of stolen labor, is the only part of the tower designed to survive the earthquake. The second invitation hit the exact same inbox on the exact same Tuesday, sent from the exact same corporate domain. Sylvia stared at the unread email and froze for a fraction of a second. Not in shock, but in the cold, satisfying recognition of a perfectly predicted variable. She knew it was coming. Tiffany was a textbook, malignant narcissist who was biologically incapable of retiring a weapon that had successfully drawn blood. She was a predator who confused cruelty with power, and having achieved such a euphoric high from publicly executing Sylvia the previous year, she had undoubtedly spent the last 12 months foaming at the mouth for the chance to recreate the slaughter in front of a larger audience. The attached memo was violently brief this time. "Hey, sweetie, the empire is bigger than ever. Come see." Sylvia read the venom. Then she stood up, walked to her cramped closet, and stood completely motionless staring at the hangers, executing a high-level tactical assessment that had absolutely nothing to do with fashion. The navy blue dress from last year was still hanging there. It had flawlessly executed its objective. It was the best armor she could afford while bleeding out, and it had maintained her dignity when everything else was burning. But tonight required a completely different caliber of weapon. She possessed an entirely different arsenal now. Not just liquid cash, though she wielded more of that than she had in decades, but the terrifying, unchained freedom that detonates when your choices are no longer violently suppressed by poverty. She walked out of the apartment that afternoon and marched straight into a hyper-exclusive designer boutique she had spent her entire life walking past with the pragmatic, invisible armor of a woman who knows she isn't allowed inside. She kicked the doors open. The gown she selected was a vastly different shade of blue than the previous year. Not the muted, defensive navy of a survivor, but a blinding, razor-sharp sapphire. The architectural cut was lethal, refusing to scream for cheap attention, but possessing such terrifying structural dominance that it instantly consumed all the oxygen in the room. The diamonds she selected were minimalist and exorbitantly expensive, the exact kind of ice that old money instantly recognizes, and new money is terrified of without understanding why. The black car she chartered was a heavily tinted European import, radiating the aggressive, silent menace of an object that requires zero flashy branding because the engineering does the talking. Peter walked into the living room as she was doing a final check in the mirror. He stopped dead in his tracks, sweeping his eyes over her with the profound, heavy recognition of a son who realizes he is no longer looking at his mother's armor, but at her loaded weapon. "Is tonight the night?" he asked softly. Tonight is the night. He closed the distance and wrapped his arms around her in a crushing bear hug. Not the desperate, protective embrace of a boy terrified for his mother, but the fierce, blood-pumping embrace of a soldier sending his general to the front lines. "Burn them to the ground, Mom," he whispered into her hair. She walked out the door. Sylvia's breach into the grand ballroom lasted less than 30 seconds, and it violently detonated the atmospheric pressure of the entire room. It wasn't just the sapphire gown. It wasn't the imported car out front. It wasn't a single isolated variable that could be scoffed at and dismissed. It was the staggering, apocalyptic sum of the parts. And above all, it was the terrifying, radioactive aura of a woman who had walked through hell, conquered the devil, and returned wearing his teeth as a necklace. Every single step she took carried the crushing gravity of the war she had won, yet she moved as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Heads aggressively snapped in her direction, not all at once. It was a brutal, rolling shockwave that rippled from the perimeter of the room straight to the epicenter. Sylvia carved through the sea of tuxedos with the lethal, bored ease of an apex predator patrolling a cage she owned. She knew the physical architecture of that ballroom better than anyone breathing, because she had quite literally drawn the floor plans. Tiffany spotted her from across the bar. In that microscopic first glance, Tiffany's face violently glitched. The horrifying, buffering panic of a predator who expected to see a broken, bleeding gazelle in a clearance rack dress, and instead found a fully armored tank rolling through the front door. Tiffany's lips frantically started moving, whispering to her sycophant bodyguards with the desperate, chaotic urgency of a politician trying to spin a catastrophe before the press gets hold of it. "What the hell is that bankrupt loser doing in that gown?" she hissed. The venom hissed across the room, carrying on the quiet acoustics of a ballroom that hadn't yet reached peak volume, aggressively spoken by a woman who arrogantly assumed she didn't need to modulate her voice. Sylvia heard every single syllable. She kept gliding forward. Stationed near the grand entrance were two massive private equity sharks she knew intimately. Men who had aggressively bankrolled the firm for decades, and who had greeted her with genuine, authentic warmth in the old days, back when she was safely neutralized as Richard's wife, and hadn't yet been erased by corporate propaganda. She walked straight up to them, addressing them by their first names, surgically inquiring about their current offshore zoning permits and their kids' trust funds. The conversation was fluid, laced with lethal, high-level industry intelligence, and in their eyes, Sylvia watched the terrifying, real-time recalibration of two apex capitalists who suddenly realized the pathetic victim narrative they had been spoon-fed didn't match the billionaire standing right in front of them. Richard materialized out of the crowd, his shoulders ratcheted tight with the violent, coiled tension she had spent 2 decades learning to decode. His face was a horrifying mask, not just standard irritation, but the complex, nauseating panic of a CEO who is processing catastrophic data he cannot comprehend and has absolutely no idea how to stop the bleeding. He marched up to her, projecting the aggressive, territorial dominance of a man trying to regain control of a hostage situation. But the microscopic tremor in his jaw gave the game away immediately. "What the hell are you doing here?" he growled, dropping his voice to a lethal, guttural frequency designed to project dominance without triggering a scene. "Did you come back to beg for scraps again?" Sylvia locked eyes with him. There was an electric, terrifying charge in that exact microsecond. It was the absolute culmination of 365 days of bleeding, plotting, and surviving, colliding with the opening bell of the execution she was about to perform. She stepped over the threshold with the ice-cold, sociopathic calm she had been cultivating for a year. "Beg?" she whispered, and her tone wasn't laced with desperate, reckless rage. It was the terrifying, weightless amusement of a god swatting a fly. "No, Richard. I came to teach a master class." He opened his mouth to bark a threat. She was already turning her back and walking straight toward the main stage. The podium still held the hot microphone used for the opening gala announcements. Sylvia glided up the 2 carpeted steps with the exact same flawless, unhurried precision she had deployed the year prior. But this calm was fundamentally different. This wasn't the agonizing, white-knuckle restraint of a victim holding back tears. This was the serene, terrifying peace of the executioner flipping the switch. Tiffany saw her mount the stage and violently shoved her way through the crowd, radiating the frantic, unhinged panic of a woman desperately trying to unplug a bomb. But her path was instantly obstructed by the 2 private equity sharks Sylvia had just briefed, men who suddenly found themselves, accidentally, standing in Tiffany's way. holding their ground with the immovable concrete inertia of billionaires who aren't explicitly blocking you but absolutely refuse to move. Sylvia gripped the microphone. The sprawling ballroom began to bleed out into silence, a terrifying, creeping quiet that consumes a room when the elite realize a massive, unscripted detonation is about to happen on stage. 1 year ago, she echoed, her voice slicing through the $100,000 sound system, slow and lethal. I was publicly branded a loser, standing in this exact room, speaking into this exact microphone. She paused. It wasn't theatrical flair. It was the heavy, suffocating silence required for the missile to reach terminal velocity. Tonight, I am here to issue a corporate mandate. She reached inside the silk lining of her sapphire gown and retrieved a heavy, folded legal document. It bore the unmistakable embossed gold seal that elite corporate law firms use when they are filing a death warrant. She snapped it open. She stared dead into the crowd for one agonizing second. Then she read the kill shot. I am officially notifying this room that, through a series of aggressive, hostile proxy acquisitions executed over the last 6 months, my holding company now legally possesses a 51% controlling stake in the primary supply chain conglomerates that service Richard Alves developments. A brutal, suffocating pause. Without my explicit legal authorization, this entire empire ceases to exist. The ballroom absorbed the blast exactly the way boardrooms absorb a catastrophic market crash. Not with screaming chaos, but with a terrifying synchronized gasp. It was a violent, rippling shockwave that started in the front row and obliterated the back walls as 200 executives snapped their necks toward each other, their eyes screaming the panic their paralyzed jaws couldn't articulate. Richard was frozen dead center in the room. He was a wax statue. Struck by a sniper bullet his nervous system hadn't even registered yet. His eyes blown wide, his shoulders violently hitched up in a defensive flinch, trapped in the horrifying realization that he was already a dead man standing. Sylvia gracefully stepped off the stage. She didn't march toward the exit. She walked directly into the blast crater, straight to the dead center of the ballroom where Richard was paralyzed. She tucked the gold-embossed dossier neatly under her arm, leaving the hot microphone on the stand. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him, closing the distance to the precise proximity required for an execution. "You stripped me to the bone, Richard," she whispered. Her voice carried absolutely zero rage. It was the terrifying, clinical exactitude of a coroner reading a time of death. "But you arrogantly forgot that I am the architect who built you. As of this morning, I am your majority partner. And I am officially voting to terminate you as CEO at the emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Richard's face violently drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent gray as all the blood evacuated his skull. He couldn't utter a single syllable. There was absolutely no defense he could deploy that wouldn't accelerate his own slaughter. Tiffany finally broke through the crowd, hyperventilating, her face twisted from smug arrogance into pure, unadulterated terror. The blood-red gown that was supposed to be her victory flag was now the dress she was wearing to her own funeral. "This is a psychotic lie," she shrieked. Her voice shattered the hushed room, soaring into a frantic, hysterical pitch, the agonizing sound of a rat trapped in a burning cage. "This is a massive, fabricated scam. You don't own a damn thing." Sylvia slowly unclasped her leather portfolio. She pulled out the notarized contract. She placed it face up on the nearest cocktail table, with the terrifying, unhurried precision of a woman who had rehearsed this exact muscle movement 1,000 times in the dark. "Signatures are federally notarized," she stated, ice cold. "Dated 3 months ago. You are welcome to run the SEC filing numbers right now." A 1-second pause to twist the knife. "Do you want to read the fine print yourself, Tiffany? Pull up a chair. Or do you prefer to stand while the entire room watches you bleed?" Tiffany stared down at the contract. She scanned the ink with the frantic, bulging eyes of a hostage desperately searching for a loophole, a typo, a glitch in the matrix that would make the nightmare disappear. She found absolutely nothing, because there was nothing to find. The ironclad execution order was real. It was lethal. It was the flawless, impenetrable product of a 6-month Black Ops campaign architected by a genius who knew that a single cracked brick would collapse the entire tower. Tiffany's knees buckled before her brain even authorized her to sit. She violently collapsed into the nearest chair, stripped of every ounce of fake elegance, physically imploding as she was brutally evicted from the fairy tale she had stolen before she even got to the ending. The entire grand ballroom was locked in a cryogenic freeze. It wasn't the mocking, humiliating silence of last year, the toxic silence that laughs at the victim. This was the deafening, terrified silence of 200 apex predators, violently recalculating the food chain, staring at the empty stage, staring at the sobbing woman in the red dress, and staring at the lethal contract on the table with the horrifying realization that the movie they thought they were watching was actually a public execution. Sylvia straightened her spine. She swept her eyes across the elite crowd, not flashing a psychotic, triumphant grin, but radiating that terrifying, absolute serenity of a god who just finished leveling a city and doesn't require a round of applause to know the buildings are gone. "I am not going to liquidate this firm," she projected to the hushed room, her voice echoing with the authority of a sovereign dictating terms. "I am simply taking back the keys to the empire I built." She slowly pivoted her head to lock eyes with Richard one final time. "You are officially unemployed, effective immediately." Then she shifted her gaze down to Tiffany. "And those luxury penthouses you love showing off on Instagram, they were illegally purchased using my stolen marital assets. I am seizing those titles by Friday." The very first clap echoed from the private equity shark she had briefed at the entrance. Then a second, then a third. And suddenly, the ballroom, not every single coward but the overwhelming majority of the room, erupted into a deafening, thunderous applause. It wasn't polite golf clap etiquette. It was the visceral, involuntary roar of respect that humans are biologically forced to give when they witness absolute, undeniable power, perfectly executed. Sylvia walked away from the stage for the second time in her life. This time, she didn't lock herself in a bathroom stall to cry. She walked straight out the front doors. "Now I'm asking you, if you were in Sylvia's shoes, after the psychological torture Richard and Tiffany inflicted, after the stolen blueprints, the sabotaged college tuition, the locked bank accounts, the blacklisted job offers, and the public execution at the gala, would you have dropped the nuclear bomb the exact same way? Would you have suffered in silence for a year to build an inescapable trap? Or would you have exploded sooner, fighting a different war? Drop your verdict in the comments. I want to know exactly what you would do." Sylvia's elite architectural firm officially launched 6 months later, occupying the penthouse floor of a skyscraper in the financial district, with a panoramic view of her grandfather's commercial lots. Not a coincidence, but a poetic, symmetrical flex that she noted the day she signed the lease and kept entirely to herself. It was a brutal, bleeding-edge incubator for young phenoms. Not the sterile corporate drones, but the actual prodigies. Hungry architects who possessed terrifying genius but lacked the blue blood portfolios, who desperately needed an apex predator to bankroll their visions before the industry crushed them. Sylvia had handpicked every single one of them with the ruthless precision of a woman who knows exactly what it feels like to be bleeding in the shadows, and knows exactly what a loaded gun looks like. Peter was operating out of the exact same floor. He had re-enrolled in his engineering program the second the empire shifted, graduating with that fierce, battle-scarred pride that degrees carry when they were violently fought for, and he had secured a desk at his mother's firm. Not through pathetic nepotism, but because he was a terrifyingly brilliant engineer. And Sylvia was the exact kind of ruthless CEO who wouldn't have hired her own blood if he was mediocre. They shared that rare, invincible dynamic of two elite professionals who deeply respect each other's firepower and just happen to share the same DNA, which is vastly more dangerous than either bond alone. On a random Tuesday morning, a junior partner mentioned they had spotted Richard sitting in a cheap coffee shop downtown. Sitting completely alone, with a classified section of a newspaper folded open on the table, wearing the hollow, panicked stare of a man scrolling through executive job postings and realizing the industry has absolutely zero use for a fraud who shows up without the stolen genius that got him into the VIP room in the first place. Tiffany had bailed months before that. She had delivered the kill shot through a divorce attorney, because right up until the bitter end, she weaponized proxies to do the dirty work she was too cowardly to do to his face. She filed the papers stating the relationship was irreparably broken, which was the legally sanitized way of saying her sugar daddy had run out of sugar and was no longer useful to her. Richard had been legally stripped of his CEO title during that first blood-soaked emergency board meeting, exactly as Sylvia promised. But he was permitted to retain a microscopic equity fraction that paid out a pathetic middle-class dividend, just enough to keep him out of a homeless shelter. Sylvia hadn't authorized the payout out of some bleeding heart sentimental mercy. She authorized it because the corporate restructuring legally required it, and because completely annihilating him into dust wasn't the mission parameter she had established during her year in the dark. The mission had been the hostile takeover of the throne, and the mission was accomplished. At an elite industry summit a few months later, Sylvia was negotiating with two massive steel suppliers when she sensed a shift in the air pressure over her right shoulder. She turned around. It was Tiffany. Gone was the blood-red couture. Gone were the blinding diamonds. Gone was the aggressive, territorial posture of a woman trying to consume all the oxygen in the room. She was wearing something generic, muted, not poverty-stricken, but projecting the pathetic, deflated simplicity of a soldier who was stripped of her armor and hasn't yet figured out how to buy new plates. Hovering in her eyes was a desperation Sylvia recognized, not by name, but by the jagged texture of it. The shattered stare of a woman who finally comprehended the catastrophic price of her arrogance and had absolutely no idea how to pay the bill. "Sylvia," she choked out. Her voice was completely hollowed out. Not the booming, sociopathic voice of the microphone. Not the vicious sneer of the toast to the losers. It was the raspy, broken frequency of someone attempting to do something agonizingly painful, knowing they are about to be slaughtered. "I really needed to talk to you. If you could just find it in your heart to give me one more chance." Sylvia stared dead into her eyes and let her finish the pathetic sentence. Then she stood in absolute, terrifying silence for a long moment. Not debating her mercy, but basking in the icy clarity of a god. She had wargamed this exact ambush in her head months ago. Not because she had a crystal ball, but because weak parasitic predators are incredibly predictable, and it always pays to have the bullet loaded in the chamber before they corner you. "Tiffany," she whispered, deploying that lethal subsonic voice she had spent a year perfecting, the tone that requires zero volume to snap a spine. "I learned the hard way that life always collects its debts, but I don't need to be the one to break your legs. The universe is going to collect the bill all by itself." And she turned her back. Not with screaming rage, not with a dramatic theatrical smirk. She executed the pivot with the brutal, absolute indifference of a woman who had just taken out the trash and had absolutely nothing left to say to the garbage bag. The cemetery was buried on the far side of the city, in a historic district that had stubbornly resisted gentrification. Ancient, sprawling oaks, weathered granite headstones accumulating the moss of decades, radiating that heavy, pressurized silence that isn't the absence of life, but the overwhelming presence of something vastly more profound. Sylvia parked the black car on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She brought a single blood-red rose, not because she knew it was her grandfather's favorite. She honestly had no idea what his favorite flower was, but because a blood-red rose carried the exact, heavy, cinematic gravity required for the message she needed to deliver. She also brought the rusted brass key, buried deep inside her cashmere coat pocket, pulsing against her hip with the tactile, heavy reality of a weapon that had successfully executed its only mission on Earth. Her grandfather's headstone was brutally minimalist: name, birth, death, and a single ruthless epitaph her father had ordered carved into the granite. A man of his word. She slid the red rose into the cracked stone vase. Then she pulled the heavy brass key out of her coat. She rested it in her open palm for a long minute. The oxidized, blackened metal, the jagged teeth of a forgotten era, the tiny lethal artifact that had slept inside a dusty envelope for decades, quietly waiting for the apocalypse. She gripped the key with both hands and gently laid it on top of the granite slab. She stood in absolute, suffocating silence for a long moment. It was the specific heavy silence that exists in graveyards, not out of morbid obligation, but because it is the only frequency capable of transmitting certain conversations. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered to the stone. "You pulled me out of the fire." The ancient oaks groaned, their branches violently swaying in the late afternoon wind. The sun was bleeding out into the western skyline, painting the cemetery in that brutal, bruised purple light specific to days that are aggressively ending, but refuse to die quietly. Sylvia stood her ground for a few more minutes. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the red rose, leaving the rusted key, and leaving behind a massive, suffocating weight that didn't have a name, but had been crushing her ribs for far too long. That quiet patch of dirt, that granite slab, that ghost of a man who had buried a nuclear bomb in the dirt decades before she even knew she needed it, was the exact, perfect place to finally lay her armor down. They say revenge is a dish best served freezing cold. But absolute apocalyptic justice is a banquet that requires agonizing patience to cook, served dead center on the table of the exact person they tried to starve to death. Sylvia didn't gorge herself in a frantic panic. She didn't eat with sloppy, blind rage. She didn't swallow the bitter, toxic ash of someone who had to burn their own soul to the ground just to win a war. She ate with the terrifying, serene satisfaction of a master architect who waited in the shadows, weaponized her own genius, and discovered that the most lethal, world-ending trump card a human being can bury is never locked inside a bank vault. It is locked inside the raw, unstealable genius that no divorce lawyer can subpoena. It is forged in the titanium dignity that public humiliation can never crack. And it is powered by the psychotic, unrelenting patience of a survivor who knows that time, when weaponized by a brilliant mind, always, inevitably, slaughters the wicked. If you live for stories about rising from the ashes, about absolute justice executing the guilty, about terrifying women who refuse to beg for permission to take back the empire they built, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join our family. Because there is always one more war story waiting in the dark, and the next one might be the exact ammunition you need to survive today.